Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. From the Enlightenment thinkers who challenged kings and empires, to the struggles for civil rights, free speech, democracy, and individual liberty, liberalism has shaped the world we live in today. Yet, in an era marked by political polarization, cultural conflict, economic uncertainty, and global change, the meaning of liberalism itself is increasingly contested. What does it truly mean to be liberal? Is liberalism the foundation of modern freedom, or has it drifted from its original principles? How has it evolved across generations, and what role will it play in the future? The future of liberalism. Next. Joining me today is historian Dr. Helena Rosenblatt. She is the Distinguished Professor of History at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of several books, and her most prominent work is The Lost History of Liberalism, From Ancient Rome to the 21st Century, which was named one of Foreign Affairs' best books in 2018. Dr. Rosenblatt, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to read something from the epilogue of your book and have you respond to that. It said the polemics over liberalism continue. A word that began as an insult is still used that way by its right wing critics. We have only to recall Ronald Reagan's famous reference to the dreaded L word to recognize the word's polemical force. American Democrats avoid using it to describe themselves for fear that it will render them unelectable. Right wing pundits call it a disease and a poison. It's a danger, they say, to moral values. How do we get to this point? Because, you lay out in the book that liberalism wasn't always necessarily seen this way. You utilize Cicero in his book on duties in 44 BC, who talked about liberalism not as a philosophy because it wasn't really present yet, but he did talk about it in a way that was very positive. So how do we get to this point where liberalism is seen as a dirty word, quite frankly?
Well, that's a great question because it's actually not a new thing. As I explain in my book, liberalism was coined in around the word was coined around 1813, and that's also when the principles that we now call liberalism came into formation and
Mhm.
created this kind of cluster of concepts that they call liberalism. But the word itself was invented as a term of abuse by counter-revolutionaries, by people who thought, who were the enemies of liberalism. And for a long time, throughout the 19th century, for example, liberalism was used that way. And liberals themselves tried to avoid the term early on. And eventually, like a lot of isms, it stuck, and liberals themselves start to use it in their way, not as an insult term. But originally, isms were very often words of insult. You have, and of kind of heresies, like you have Calvinism, Lutheranism,
Mhm.
baptism. In the beginning, these are not, pejoratives, basically. So using it as an insult is not something new. But you mentioned that going back, in Rome, the word liberal had very positive connotations. And it referred to the noble qualities of a good citizen, somebody who loved freedom, but somebody who was also generous, not selfish, somebody who thought about the public good. And this word was attached, this positive word meaning to the word liberal remained throughout its 100 years history until you get to the French Revolution, when and soon thereafter when the word liberalism was coined and people started to speak very badly about liberals,
Mhm.
liberals, the noun. Yeah, so there's been this tension in the word for a very long time. Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing?
But let me ask you this, though, because as you mentioned, the French Revolution did lead to a very negative connotation of liberalism and the word liberal itself. But prior to that, given what Cicero was talking about and others who came before him, or after him rather, how did it switch to that? Because it seemed to me that people were thinking positively of the word liberalism or the concept of liberalism because the word itself wasn't around yet. So, how did it move from what Cicero was talking about to what the French Revolution gave us?
Well, we know that during the French Revolution, this is really when the church, the Catholic Church, and the nobility were attacked, their privileges removed. So the liberals were the ones who attacked really the system, and those people who were defending the status quo, who were wanted to retain their privileges from the old regime, which were many, often feudal privileges that people, the nobility had, or the Catholic Church in France, which had huge power. They didn't recognize other religions. There was no religious toleration until around 1787, and it was limited in 1787. But the liberals really are the ones who stood for and pushed through constitutional government, civil equality, safeguards for individual rights, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And those then who were, happy with the system, so to speak, wanted to retain their privileges, called them use that word liberalism to say that it's excessive freedom. For them, this word liberalism, they said it was akin to license. It meant people who are atheists. It referred to people who are atheists, anarchists, also all sorts of evils who want to destroy, create chaos. And that's what that original term meant. Now, by the way, the revolution started in 1789, and of course, in the first couple of years, it was relatively peaceful. And if you look at textbooks today on European history, they even refer to this period as the liberal stage of the French Revolution. And then we know that it derailed into this terrible period of chaos, of the terror, chaos in the country, and then this very strong, violent government of the terror which lasted. And during that period, there was civil war, there was, vandalism of churches, a lot of really violent, awful things happened. So these people who invent the term liberalism and give it a very negative connotation were also referring to this, that and saying that inevitably liberal principles will derail into this kind of chaos and that it's dissolving of all institutions, some of which we hear again today.
Let me ask you this, though, because even though it did lead ultimately to that, it still does not define liberalism in its totality because there are different strains of liberalism. But also, why doesn't people who adhere to the concept of liberalism talk about their own history? Because it seems to me that the conservatives control the narrative when it comes to liberalism. So it talks about it in terms of individualism, which is not how it started, is not what it was ultimately all about. But conservatives have said that this is what it's all about. So in the United States, for example, we hear, conversation about the trans community and all of this stuff. But that's not what liberalism was ultimately all about. Why can't liberals defend their own history, even some of the bad stuff? Because conservatives have some negative stuff going on too. But why do they let conservatives control the narrative of their history?
So that's such a great idea. I question, and I'm a historian. So when we start talking about today and the problems of today, I'm not as good, let's say, as when I'm talking about the past. But defining liberalism has been a tricky thing for 20th century scholars. When I was asked to write this book, I was actually invited to write this book by this wonderful editor at Princeton University Press. And when I was asked to do this, there were very few histories of liberalism on the market. I mean, she came to me and said, like, it's really necessary because there's like nothing out there. Of course, things have changed in the meantime. As you mentioned, my book came out in 2018. Um, but what I said and what I noticed is that whoever it was talking about liberalism, what they would do is they would decide this is what liberalism is. And they'd have kind of their personal definition, whether it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. And then to tell its history, they would go back and sort of cherry pick concepts and ideas that would add up to their version of liberalism. And often it would involve going back to certain great thinkers or some thinkers they didn't think were good. I mean, enemies of liberalism
Mhm.
will go back to Machiavelli, they'll go to Hobbes, and they'll say that's where it all started in order to arrive at their conclusions. But liberals kind of did the same thing in their own way. So I said this was not a very historically accurate way to describe what liberalism is and has been. What is a more historically accurate way of describing the history is to actually look at what how liberals describe themselves and then see how their enemies describe them. But to try to see like what did it mean to be liberal in ancient Rome? What did it mean to be liberal in the medieval period? How did this meaning change, or did it change over time? And when was the first Liberal Party formed? What did it stand for? And then we get to, when was liberalism conceived? When was it theorized first? And what did people then say it was? And then I bring that story up until today. I just thought that was more and more. I actually conceived of it as kind of a methodological intervention, a kind of like, let's see what happens when we do this. Instead of imposing our own views to liberalism, let's see what was being said at the time about being liberal and what liberalism means. Now, I would say one thing though is I feel that liberals have since the 20th century really, and mainly since the Cold War, liberals have lost track of the history that I talk about in my book, and they've dropped an important part of the story and focused very much on how liberalism is all about protecting individual rights. And this is where kind of the conservatives in a way of today, if you look at post-liberals, there's a whole new trend of these post-liberal thinkers agree in a sense because they're saying, yeah, you're all about individual rights. You're all about protecting the individual. And that's what liberalism amounts to. What it really is a kind of selfishness. It's a kind of corrosive attitude that's destroying families, community, the nation. And liberals are kind of at a loss, I think, for words. They don't seem to have an imagination or know their history, that there are other concepts that they can draw on. The generosity that has always been, the idealism that has always been part, or was at least until the Cold War, let's say, and we can get into why that happened during the Cold War. But I think, yes, I hope I'm answering your question, but I think liberals have kind of lost the plot in a way about how to describe themselves.
Is it because liberalism, particularly in the United States, because there was a debate for a while in terms of liberalism, in terms of what should be the role of the state in terms of the uplifting of, let's say, people who are in poverty.
Yeah.
So even Adam Smith, who libertarians and conservatives try to claim as their own, but Adam Smith was quite critical of the wealthy and the like too. So we shouldn't forget that. But when you have people like Franklin Roosevelt, people like that who kind of put in a liberal agenda, in order to confront what was going on with the economy? Is it because liberals have pretty much been successful in terms of, let's say, the creation of the welfare state as it had occurred in other places, such as France and Germany? Could it be because of that, and they just needed another thing to go towards now? They'd pretty much won that.
Well, are you saying that liberals won the fight for a kind of welfare state? I think that they did in many ways, but of course, it's also been under attack
Mhm.
from both the left and the right. Mainly, we have also this phenomenon of neoliberalism, where people, and classical liberalism is something else I discuss in my book. People who say they are the true liberals and that we should dismantle most of the welfare state and deregulate the economy. And they claim to be the correct interpreters of Adam Smith. And so they feel that this liberal turn to the welfare state and to regulating the economy was a wrong move. So this is a fragile victory. The welfare state we can see today, and it's something that is constantly under attack. So I'm not sure that we can rest assured or be complacent about a liberal victory in that regard, if you look around. And then again, I think that liberals themselves are not doing a really good job in, shall we say, advertising, to use a very
Mhm.
interesting term, their own position.
That kind of goes to my original point of liberals not really having control of their own narrative. And, the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, was very adamant in terms of its beliefs about liberalism. Pope Pius the Ninth was very obstinate in terms of his denigration of it. But then again, I guess my question is, were they doing it because they really believed that, or because it was a threat to their authority and power?
You mean the
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 Catholic Church,
critics, the
yes.
Catholic Church? Oh, I think it was. I think they both believed it, and it was a threat to their power. I mean, the Catholic Church has a very different notion of community, I mean, without getting too much heavy into theology, the idea that individuals, going back to the Protestant Reformation, that claimed that, sola scriptura and free inquiry and private judgment was the way to go, that individuals should read their Bible themselves and be Christians in that way. Uh, so a focus there on the individual. The Catholic Church was very quick, and Catholic spokesman to say, well, that's kind of crazy, and it's akin to, you can't let people just read the Bible, and that means they're going to come up with their own religion, and eventually this is going to derail into atheism, basically. That what you need is a church to interpret and to teach, and that people should obey this church, and this will also allow society to cohere, communities, the family. It's very dangerous once you start giving individuals the right to examine and judge religion. The next thing is that they want to judge everything. They're going to want to judge their political system, their constitution, maybe their marriage. Maybe they don't want to be married anymore. And you're giving the individual a lot of too much power, which will erode um, everything, cohesion altogether. So that is really a kind of a focal point, a core principle of the Catholic Church. That doesn't mean, by the way, that there were no liberal Catholics or Catholic liberals. They certainly were, and I discuss some of them in my book. But they were until Vatican II. They were not. They were often, I'm losing the word now, when they're kicked out of the church, basically. So
Excommunicated.
excommunicated, that's the word I'm looking for. And what's interesting, of course, today is we have the post-liberals, and they are in the main Catholics or very Catholic friendly. And they're saying much of the same thing, although they're drawing the connection, close connection between Protestantism, individualism, and liberalism.
I want to talk about, you do mention in your book the the notion of the French and German participation in terms of the creation of liberalism, which has been overlooked for the most part. Talk a little bit about what the French, beyond the French Revolution, because you said some of that was quite quite positive and very peaceful, but also the German aspect of it, and what did they contribute to the idea of liberalism?
Well, that's such an important point, I think, that you bring up, because we tend to think, most of us have been taught to believe that liberal democracy and liberalism is an Anglo-American tradition. That it came, let's say, some people go all the way back to Magna Carta, 1215 in England, but certainly they put a lot of emphasis on John Locke and John Stuart Mill. But let's say the principles of John Locke and Adam Smith, and then tell this nice story about how this came to America. And from that, you get the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, and America becomes the great defender and disseminator, if you will, of liberal democracy around the world. Now, that's not exactly how it happened, as I explain in my book. And yes, I show how liberalism was first a cluster of concepts that was really conceptualized around 1813 or a little bit before, as a reaction to the French Revolution. But then, funnily enough, Germany plays a huge role, which is quite astonishing for a lot of people, considering it's the tragic history of the world wars and the Nazism, and even France, of course, with the revolutions, the repeated revolutions. People had a hard time believing that they could, or they didn't even think that liberalism could have originated in France, and then had influence before even America plays a role. That's quite extraordinary. But what you find is that the first liberals, then the first conceptualizers of liberalism, they were really putting together a cluster of concepts, which were civil equality, constitutional government, safeguards for the individual. I think I mentioned before, and a lot of freedoms, right? Private property, free up the economy. That's what's going to create wealth, and that's going to disseminate wealth. And so that we want to dismantle all the feudal regulations that are blocking progress. So these were the original ideas. But over time, liberals have also been quite practical in confronting new problems. So as over time, with industrialization and urbanization in the 19th century, liberals start to see this new phenomenon in the urban centers, factories coming up, very obvious poor people, workers stuck in poverty. The idea was that this was going to make everybody rise up, that the freedoms, economic freedoms, are going to be good for everyone. Well, it turns out that there are these people stuck in the factory. They can't rise up. So, and you get German thinkers starting to talk about this the most. Interestingly enough, a group of German thinkers start saying, hey, wait a minute. These ideas of the Smiths and the political economists of the day, they're talking about these abstract principles. They're like drawing charts and I don't know what, and it doesn't correspond to facts on the ground. What we need to do is go and actually collect statistics, look at prices, look at wages, look at demography, and lo and behold, no, it's not leading to good things for everyone. So what we need is for the government to step in and help these workers and the economy in different ways. And these ideas then spread. into England, to America, to France, where people were translating these articles and learning from them. You know that Americans went, thousands of Americans from well-to-do families and went to Germany to study. Germany was well known for its universities, research universities. So these young men went to Germany and learned these ideas and brought them back to America. Same thing in England. They translated the works and they started to absorb them and translate them into their own idiom and here you go. In France as well. So you got this thing called new liberalism, which people called a new liberalism because it was responding to new problems of the economy, became more focused, let's say, on the economy. You already had constitutional government in England, you already had constitutional government in America, and now the problems seem to be more economic.
So let me ask you this then. Given all of that, in terms of liberalism began looking at the economics of the day, and it seems to me that the issue of liberalism was always situation based. It looked at what was going on at the time, but also understanding that even with the German contribution to it, that not everyone felt the same way about liberalism. There were some who believed in laissez-faire. There were some liberals who did not believe in it. So liberals, they have had a time of fighting amongst themselves in terms of what is liberalism. And that seems to be one of the problems that liberals face today is what exactly is it? So the question is, how did they resolve this issue, or did they resolve it at any time in their history?
You're so right. Liberals have had major heated debates from the very beginning about what it meant to be liberal and what liberalism should stand for. And what I was just describing now with this German influence and the invention of something called new liberalism, what really happened then was a schism, a very clear schism between liberals who believed in free markets, or more, everybody, they all believed in free markets to a certain extent, but how much government regulations you should government step in, and factory laws and all sorts of government interventions in the economy. Should you have that, or should you go more in the laissez-faire route? And that's when you have the invention of something. So you have new liberalism, but you have the others who say, no, we're the classical liberals. This is
Mhm.
orthodox liberalism. This is classical liberalism. And it's the new liberalism that's eventually exported to the United States. And you have the Republican progressives calling themselves calling themselves liberal, eventually the Wilsonian liberals. Woodrow Wilson starts calling himself a liberal. But what's very funny is until um, like Herbert Hoover's time, you still have this fight about who's the real liberal. And as you say, it's still kind of going on.
Mhm.
But at that, there's a very funny, I think, I hope you agree, a part of my book where there's actually a like a verbal dispute between Hoover and FDR about or about who's the liberal, and Hoover basically says, gets so frustrated and says, "Okay, you guys can have the word. It's lost its meaning." And FDR in an important speech uses the word like 6 times or something, and really takes control of that word. And from then on, it was became like a democratic word to describe democratic principles as opposed to Republican ones. And I think this fight over the word, which is so interesting to me, also is because that word, the core of the word, going back to Rome, was something beautiful. It meant freedom loving and generous. Now, who can be against that? So we
Mhm.
want the word, we want it. Um, but yeah, the Republicans lost it in FDR's time. Some are reclaiming it. Those libertarians are reclaiming it today.
You also claim that Lincoln in some respects was liberal.
That's
Now he called himself he was a Whig, which was more compatible with liberal ideology.
true.
So, but how does Lincoln fit into this for you?
Lincoln fits into this in a special way in my book, and that is that America was always considered until Lincoln's time as a kind of dangerous experiment. It was a democracy. There was no democracy really in England, or I mean in Europe at that time, and they looked at America really as a new kind of experiment, and that many thought was bound to fail. Right? And then you had the Civil War, and there's a year you go, this is going to fail, it's going to fall apart. There's no way a democracy, even a so-called liberal democracy, can survive. And then you had Lincoln, and he proved to people, to observers in Europe, he proved them wrong. Here was a morally uplifting leader who held his country together and really had the highest moral principles, showed that a liberal democracy could be I stress this word because it was important, a moral fiber to it. It was you know, he appealed to the highest instincts, the what do we call that? The better angels of people's natures. His speeches were uplifting. What he did was beautiful, and in that way, he was liberal, in the old meaning of the word, noble, freedom-loving, but and generous, and he had high moral principles, and that is how around the world. The word liberal, also had that positive connotation and was used to describe Lincoln as a moral leader. And people started to think differently about the United States.
Let me ask you this, because I want to get into some of the hypocrisies of liberalism, which also defines hypocrisies of conservatives as well. I mean, Edmund Burke was not, all that good as well. He had some hypocrisies as well. But liberalism was not seen as necessarily um, aligned with democracy.
Yeah.
And there are also, you read about liberals who were in favor of eugenics, as were conservatives, such as Winston Churchill. But you have these hypocrisies, which also put liberals in a not too great light. But that can be said about a lot of philosophies as well. So, but how did liberals really deal with that? Because there were liberals who um, supported slavery, supported the South. The Pope at the time during the Civil War supported the South. So, everyone has some blame here. But how did they reconcile that? The fact that liberalism was not the same as democracy. In fact, a lot of liberals did not believe necessarily in democracy and the idea that everyone should be able to vote. How did they reconcile that?
It's a great question and a big one, and I love it. First, we today talk about liberal democracy as if that's if that's an easy pairing that they kind of go together, but their traditions are very different, right? I said liberalism was really invented in 1812 or 13 around then, and that it referred also to I'm not going to go over it again. I've said it, but the democracy goes way back to ancient Greece, right? And it really meant people power. And for hundreds of years, democracy was seen as the worst kind of rule imaginable. They didn't have the concept for a long time of representative democracy. So they thought of it as direct rule of the people and, so mob rule kind of like they thought of it that way. Especially in a large country, how could you have everybody legislate? That just doesn't make any sense, right? And so it's only when and liberals from the very beginning or to be liberal was to be member of a kind of aristocracy. I said like citizens in Rome were a small elite because you had slavery, you had, women didn't have rights. So there was a small group, relatively small group of men who could be liberal, let's say. But they always had these high expectation of citizens who wanted to be liberal. And throughout the centuries, it has always been it was always an aristocratic ethos how to be liberal. It was the first the behavior and the morals of a citizen in Rome, and then of a Christian during the medieval period, and during the Enlightenment, it becomes the word liberal is used to describe a very polite gentleman who's open-minded and tolerant and sociable before it becomes this political thing during the French Revolution when it starts to describe a political posture and an attitude to a constitution. But it was still the early liberals, and I discuss Benjamin Constant, who I've written a book about, and Madame de Stael, who I'm about to write a book about. They did not believe that everybody should have a vote. They thought of the people as irrational, prone to violence. They didn't understand what was good for everyone. They were very selfish in that sense, and they would feel bad for the poor, but they say like they have no education. They are illiterate. How can they possibly know how to run a country? We have to do it for them. Democracy was actually kind of forced on liberals by despots and demagogues. Napoleon, ruled by plebiscite. Could say that he's kind of in a way, he was a democracy in a way because plebiscites, everybody votes. Again, his nephew, Napoleon III, very similar. So eventually, the idea of a democracy, of giving everybody or all men a vote, was forced on the liberals. And it's only by the end of the 19th century that you have this term, liberal democracy, actually be coined and come into use.
I wanted to ask a question. You mentioned Benjamin Constant, and one of the stories I was reading in your book was his whether need or whatever to align himself with Napoleon III
No, no. Benjamin Constant it was Napoleon, the first Napoleon.
first.
Yeah,
Talk about that a little bit because there are people who critiqued him for that.
yeah.
So, how did he reconcile that?
Well, there was a joke, I think during his lifetime, but also afterwards, about calling him the inconstant constant, because the inconstant constant, because and call him a weather vane because he flipped, and they claim that it has a lot to do with who was his girlfriend at the time. So, he was a bit of a womanizer, for sure, and a gambler. So, well, the story of Napoleon and his relationship with the liberals is a fascinating one. At first, people like Constant and Madame de Stael supported him, even through his coup d'état. They thought that he would save the revolution, save the liberal part of the
Mhm.
revolution. This happened, he became this amazing general in the 90s. 1790s, and became such a hugely charismatic figure that they thought maybe this is the man who's going to save the revolution. The French have this predilection for after having centuries of an absolute monarch, they need a strong man. But here we have a good strong man who's going to help us bring order to the country. There's a civil war going on. There's foreign wars. He's a general. He's going to take care of everything, and he's going to be a good guy. And he made all the noises, Napoleon, that he was going to be a good guy in the beginning, right? But then, of course, pretty quickly he turns himself into a despot, and people like the liberals, like Benjamin Constant and Madame de Stael, become his enemies and adversaries and suffer the consequences, exile and censorship and all of that. But to jump to what happens, because it's a long and fascinating story, and I don't want to take too much time. But basically, what happens with Benjamin Constant, and here he and Madame de Stael, they were this formidable partnership and also a romantic relationship between the two of them. Turbulent one, fascinating one. Um, but here they part ways because when during the Hundred Days, Napoleon is defeated. He gets sent to the island of Elba, but he escapes. He comes back to France, and he comes back and he is again the ruler for the famous Hundred Days in 1815, right? And this is when Benjamin Constant decides I'll work with him. I'll work with Napoleon. He's now been chastened. He's been defeated. He's making the noises again that he's asked me to write a constitution, to amend the constitution, to make it a liberal constitution. And so Benjamin Constant has got a girlfriend in Paris. Says, okay, all right,
Why not?
I'll work with him. Hell, I'll work with him. And he writes a very good, very interesting and liberal constitution. I mean, he puts in all the safeguards that they want. And but lo and behold, Napoleon can't control himself, and he makes war again and eventually defeated at Waterloo. And Benjamin Constant has to escape to England with his tail between his legs and wait there when there's the Restoration and see if he'd be welcomed back to France or not. And he is. And he ends up being a great hero in France. He's given a state funeral in 1830 when he dies for having taught France the principles of liberal, not liberal democracy yet, but liberal principles in any case. He's very much appreciated for that in France to this day.
But it is important to remember Constant because he is a great contributor to the ideal or the idea of liberalism. And so he may be one of those forgotten characters, but he is an important contributor to the idea of liberalism. I want to talk a little bit about the United States, liberalism in the United States. Um, it is a much maligned philosophy, as it has been over the centuries, over the years. But it is to the point now where folks don't even want to acknowledge that they are liberal anymore.
Yeah.
And so, how did we get to that point? Because right now, it is really about individual rights. It is pretty much swept aside some of the grandiose ideas of liberalism, going back to Cicero and being generous and the like. So, how did we lose all of that to where we are now? And that is not to say that being for the individual is bad,
Right.
but when that becomes all that you're known for, there's a problem there. So how do we get to that point in the United States?
With the rise of Stalinism and the rise of Nazism, liberals felt the need to distinguish themselves from this. You have during the Cold War, you have Hayek um, saying that this new liberalism, the welfare state, is putting us on the slippery slope to totalitarianism. And many people then wanted in America and England to distinguish themselves from what was going on in Europe. And then so they wanted to say, no, what we really are for is the individual rights. We are not totalitarians. We are liberals. We are for property rights. We are not for a state that controls everything. So they start to really emphasize individual rights. And I think that's really when they lost a more moral message. And I don't want to exaggerate. And as you just said, individual rights, you can see that as a moral thing, that it is a generous thing to give people individual rights. But at the same time, to shy away from a government to talking about government's responsibility and our responsibility to our fellow citizens, to drop that out of the discussion, our obligations, our responsibilities as citizens, to stop talking about that, I think is a gigantic mistake.
Mhm. Well, part of it, as at least as I read your book, it was about all of these things were included because individual rights would have been included, even in terms of being generous and the like. But it was for a bigger purpose. It could even be, what Martin Luther King called the beloved community.
Mm.
So the question is, how do liberals get back to that? Because they've lost that sense. I know your book is not prescriptive,
Yes.
but you've seen the history of it. You've written the history of it. How do liberals get back to that grandiose vision of what liberalism could be? Because liberalism, in its first iteration, was really aspirational,
Yeah.
whereas conservatism is maintained. So, how do we get back to that aspirational aspect of liberalism, or what Cicero was talking about?
Well, one thing is to have podcasts like this and ask people to read books like mine. Sorry, a
Yep,
little bit of self-promotion there. But
absolutely.
but I do believe that there are great thinkers in the so-called liberal tradition that we can draw on today that are not normally drawn on. I mean, I love Locke and I love Mill and especially perhaps John Stuart Mill.
Mhm.
But I think we can. I mentioned some other thinkers in my book. For example, we have T.H. Green, we have Hobhouse. We have people who are recognized liberal thinkers that have kind of dropped out of our conversation. So I think that we can, some of this language, some of these concepts, and language is so important, we can draw on from that lost tradition of liberalism. Plus, you know what? I'm very much in favor of something happening in the United States right now, and it tends to be in conservatives and red states. And that is, from what I understand, but that is this popping up of these sort of civics centers, centers for the humanities, teaching our young people the story, the good story, the inspirational story of the founding fathers and of all the people who have fought, not only the founding fathers, clearly, and not to say that they weren't terribly flawed, like all human beings are, but draw from these thinkers and from the tradition to get students to engage with it for good and bad, but get students and young people and involved with engaging with these thinkers. I think is one way to start to kind of recalibrate our language and enrich the concepts that liberals are drawing on and are propagating.
Mhm. You mentioned that there are some brilliant thinkers today in terms of liberalism. Who would some of those thinkers be? Obviously including yourself, that people should be reading, listening to, in order to
Well,
get back to the original aspirational aspect of liberalism, which includes, at least in my opinion, does include individual rights. It includes
yes.
individualism. But who are some of those thinkers?
I'm not so good on contemporary thinkers, but I can recommend a couple of good books.
Mhm.
I really do like my friend, two friends of mine actually, who've written very good books that are inspirational and while being historically accurate, also give us some concepts to build on from our own history. I say our because I consider myself a liberal. It's Alan Cahan's. I think I can't remember the title, which is terrible, but Alan Cahan has a really good book out. And also my friend Alexandre Lefebvre, who has Liberalism as a Way of Life. And these books really encourage us to think of the good in liberalism and its history and are can inspire us quite a bit. I mean, John Rawls is a modern liberal, and
Mhm.
people call him one of the maybe the most important philosopher, American philosopher of the 20th century, and I of course respect him as a thinker, but I'm not a total fan. I'm not. I think we have to find a way to communicate that state neutrality when it comes to a moral good does not mean no moral good,
Right.
right? Liberals stand for some very important values, including personal flourishing, building of character. Individuals need the space and the individual rights in order to improve themselves and to be able to be good, be the best person they can do, and therefore contribute to the community. And we do have responsibilities to one another. And when we cultivate ourselves, when we educate ourselves and are encouraged to build our character, this will naturally flow. When we read these wonderful philosophers and thinkers of the past, we will see this, we will understand these concepts, and we can discuss them in the classroom or in newspapers or on podcasts like this. So I think a lot of people have a role to play in kind of fixing liberalism, if you want. It has lost its way a little bit. And that's where I think conservatives and post-liberals, they have a point. They have a point. I think we have kind of lost the plot a bit.
Would it be fair to say that liberals, even though they've lost their way and there's maybe too much emphasis on individualism, that throughout the years have had great accomplishments?
Oh, yes.
And they probably need to also talk about that a little
Oh,
bit.
yes.
Recall the history, the aspirational aspect, the original aspirational aspect of liberalism, and then to move on from there, as opposed to just staying very narrow minded, which is what they are now, very narrow. Um, but can they regain their prominence
Well, I
if they
think
do these things?
you're so right. I should have said that as well. I mean, we need to communicate. Liberal politicians should communicate the fact that how much how much Democrats and liberals actually delivered in the 50s and 60s, for example, rising living standards, all sorts of measures shows that the government, the welfare state, if you will, was working for everyone,
Mhm.
raising everyone at the and doing all this good for the country. So we have to, and today we have to, follow up on that. And there are people who are saying there's a several recent books that I think are very good about liberals actually have to be more, practical minded and deliver on the promises. We have a housing crisis, right? We have an environmental crisis, and we just have to deliver. How to get that to happen? Some people say that it's starts in communities. I'm reading a very good book by Daron Acemoglu right now, who's the Nobel Prize winning economist at MIT. He talks about AI, making it work for workers.
Mhm.
And he has some very good ideas about that. We have to start thinking about practical ways to make these beautiful principles, freedom and generosity, to actually implement those, show that they work somehow. Yeah, to deal with the vast inequalities right now, and the polarization. Of course, AI plays a very big role, and somebody's going to have to figure out how to fix that situation.
It might be Pope Leo. Who knows?
Yeah, absolutely.
My guest today has been Dr. Helena Rosenblatt, the Distinguished Professor of History at the Graduate Center of City University of New York. Dr. Rosenblatt, I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
And join us again next week as we deal with another issue of global importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.